Okay, is it still morning? Is it still May 9th? It doesn't feel like it. I'm sure this is May 15th by now. So good afternoon, and we are so excited by this attendance. And I see our former student body vice president back there in the audience. I see you. Fidel trying to act like you're not here. He just put his head down. Good morning, excuse me. Told you I'm not sure what day it is. Welcome to our final set of panels. And you have chosen to join one that is quite timely. So welcome to our panel about gun violence reduction efforts. We had a different discussion yesterday about gun violence, but this one is from a different perspective. This conversation is more pressing than ever. I missed the morning news. I hear there was another shooting this morning. We are faced daily with firearm-related deaths, and they are becoming the leading cause of death among young people. In 2022 alone, 648 mass shootings. And in 2023, unfortunately, we are set to have another record, which we don't want. So we're excited to have Jonathan Capehart guide and facilitate this conversation. Yes, give him a round of applause. Jonathan's journalism is extensive. He is a Pulitzer Prize-winning associate editor and opinion writer for The Washington Post, as well as the host of the Saturday show and the Sunday show with Jonathan Capehart. But most importantly, he cares about these issues. He stays informed about these issues. He got here early enough to learn, and so these issues are near and dear to his heart. I learned from him on his shows. So please join me in welcoming Jonathan Capehart, who will moderate this wonderful panel.
Thank you very much, President Mason, for that introduction, and also for the invitation to be here and to moderate this panel. On May 1st, we held a planning call for today's discussion. That was 8 days ago. And according to the Gun Violence Archive, there have been 21 mass shootings since then, in that time. Mass shootings defined as at least 4 victims shot, either injured or killed. And while the nation is rightly fixated on those mass shootings, they have a tendency to obscure the gun violence that does not rise to the horrific standard of mass shooting. A report issued by Pew Research Center last month notes, and I'm quoting here, "More Americans died of gun-related injuries in 2021 than in any other year on record, according to the latest available statistics from the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention." It goes on to note there were a record 48,830 total gun deaths in 2021, a 23% increase since 2019, before the onset of the coronavirus pandemic. Gun murders rose 45% during that time, and gun suicides rose 10%. Children and teens were particularly impacted. Gun deaths rose for them by 50% during a 2-year period, 2019 to 2021. Our goal today is twofold: figure out what's driving this trend and how to reduce gun violence, or at least try to. We have assembled a great panel to talk this out. Right next to me is Tennessee State Representative Harold Love Jr., Manhattan District Attorney Alvin Bragg, Nick Suplina, Senior Vice President for Law and Policy at Everytown for Gun Safety, and Greg Jackson, Executive Director of Community Justice Action Fund. Thank you all very much for being on the panel. Now, before we get into this very serious discussion, we have some news to get to. So let me ask our co-host for today, the President of the National Urban League, Mark Morial, to say a few words.
First of all, testing. Again, good morning to all. I want to thank Jonathan Capehart. Another round of applause for Jonathan Capehart, and for this great panel. And Mayor Jones is here, and we had an incredible panel with the mayor. So another round of applause for Mayor Jones and to each and every one of us. But this is pressing, Jonathan, and I wanted to just engage D.A. Bragg for a minute because you've been at the vortex of high-profile cases. Your office is one of the most significant prosecutorial offices anywhere in the nation. And just recently here in New York, we had the incident involving Jordan Neely, another yet high-profile case. And I think it's important in these discussions for people to understand how you and your office go about thinking, addressing, fulfilling your responsibilities in connection with these cases. And here, many things have been on the minds of the conferees, and Jordan Neely and what happened to him have been on the minds of the honorees. So I thought it important before you all get into the discussion for you to maybe give us a perspective, give us some insight on how you're thinking about this.
Sure. Well, thank you for the invitation. Generally, as you know, I'm a league baby. My father ran the Manhattan Urban League when I was a child, and it's always a pleasure, President Mason, to be at John Jay. And we talked about this a little bit at dinner last night. And you're right, we've had this come up a few times during my tenure. High-profile matter that the public knows a lot about, which is different from the vast majority of how our cases start, that aren't in the papers and obviously affect everyday New Yorkers deeply. And so we follow the facts, and I've now been saying that in a bunch of contexts, and that's what we do. We carefully scrutinize after we gather it, all available evidence, and we do that work mostly, behind closed doors, and that's important because we don't want to impair investigations. And so I spent much of last year, saying that we're following the facts in a very different context and a very different investigation, but it applies here as well. And for those, I think this is true across. I always say there's 51 jurisdictions, including criminal law. I think it's true in most of them. It's certainly true here in New York that for us to speak certainly about any grand jury matter would be a felony crime. I see some ADAs in the audience nodding knowingly, and also there's case law directly on point about this, about why that is, why this secrecy is important. We don't want to impair the integrity of any investigation. I don't want to be in a situation in any case where a case is brought and someone is scrutinizing something I said, saying that infected a petit jury or a grand jury, or in some ways conflated or led to the conflation of witness testimony or impaired someone's due process rights. So we do that across the board, and I appreciate the question because I think sometimes people peer into the silence and look at that as if, well, the office isn't doing anything or it's not important. It's quite the contrary. It is because it's our solemn obligation to assess the facts and apply the facts to the law and how gravely and seriously we take that we don't speak lest we impair any investigation.
Thank you.
All right. Thank you for
Thank you very much. Yeah,
right.
Thank you.
Thank you very much for that question, President Morial. And now on to our discussion. So I want to start with the first question. And Greg, I will start with you. From your vantage point, what has been driving these trends in gun violence? Push it up.
All right. All right, there we go.
Yeah.
Good evening, everybody. So I just first and foremost, just really quickly, I've been in politics for now 14 years, been in the gun violence space for 10 years. And I started this space really as a survivor, frankly, someone who had worked at the highest level of politics, but was shot in the crossfire and found myself experiencing what too many of our folks have experienced in this country. And one big standing out and frankly traumatic moment for me was when I arrived at the hospital. I wasn't met with doctors and nurses. I was met with investigators that interrogated me before surgery. And the bullet that hit me hit 2 arteries, and I only had 26 minutes left to live. And I lost some of those crucial moments being interrogated about my participation in a crime that I had no role in. And I think it tells a lot about how we look at gun violence in America. We look at solving the crime first and saving the life second. And that's why we see this overwhelming investment in reactive strategies and enforcement strategies, but nickels and dimes when it comes to preventative strategies. But I think what we also underestimate is the trauma that's left after someone's impacted by violence. 40% of people who are shot will be shot again, will be killed, or will harm someone else after being a victim of gun violence. And we're not doing enough by survivors and victims. And what we're seeing at Community Justice is really driving this trend is this spread of trauma of individuals that have been exposed to violence, that have lost a loved one, lost a brother, lost a sister, and now they're going into the next conflict, and they look at that as how they handle violence. And when we look at gun violence, we're seeing these huge spikes. We saw 172% increase in teen homicide, 78% increase in black women homicides, 49% increase in homicides of black men. And that has all happened in 2019 in an era where other forms of crime have sunk, or decreased. And so I think what's really driving this crisis of gun violence throughout our country is this spread of individuals that are going untreated and unsupported after being traumatized, and communities that have been neglected but now are dealing with another wave of concentrated trauma on top of all the other challenges that COVID-19 created. And the trends are pretty consistent. We look at how COVID impacted communities and how homicide skyrocketed.
And so, Nick, from your vantage point at Everytown, what do you see as driving these trends in gun violence?
Well, far be it from me to disagree with Greg. I do think that what Greg is speaking to is a lot of the underlying causes of gun violence. One very simplistic take, though, and I'll play my role on the panel here today, is there are layers of trauma and layers of inequality in this country, all of which get expressed in a particularly violent way when you have ready access to firearms. And so that is an unavoidable component of the problem, and certainly an unavoidable, unignorable part of what's driving increases in gun violence. We have more guns extant in this country than at any point in our nation's history. We don't even know how many we have because we're not allowed to track them, but some estimates are up to 350, 400 million guns in circulation. And to boot, not the strength of gun laws necessary to keep them out of the hands of folks that shouldn't have them. And when I say that, there's a lot of inferences when we say people who should not have guns. But it can be the person who's just going through trauma. It can be the person who's going through the most difficult period in their life. And access to a firearm may lead to an outcome that is completely avoidable, whether it's harm to self or others. And so in the mix of all of the drivers of inequality and trauma in this country and the cycles of those things, and I completely agree with Greg, and in so many cases, both trauma and gun violence itself are part of the cycle of more gun violence and more trauma. But more generally speaking, we have an opportunity in this country to do something about it through prevention and through addressing the violent vector that is a firearm. Until we do that across the country at the federal level, at the state level, and I'm sure we'll talk about some of that today, we're going to see the most violent manifestation of underlying causes of trauma and inequity in this country.
And DA Bragg, of all the people on this stage, you're the person who has to deal most directly from a legal perspective with gun violence in your jurisdiction in this city. So from your vantage point, what's been driving these trends in gun violence?
So I echo what has been said. I think a lot of things, not everything, but a lot of things can be attributable to the sort of the dislocations of COVID that we all felt. Civic, school, clergy, all parts of our lives disrupted. But I also really want to put a finger on what Nick said about we just have a lot of guns. We have so many guns, and in Manhattan, really, throughout the city. But to be Manhattan focused for a moment, our guns are coming from elsewhere. And we do.
Are they still coming from the iron pipeline from Virginia, or are they coming from other places?
They are coming from Virginia, North Carolina, Pennsylvania. They're coming in through buses at the Port Authority, cars coming across the bridges, trains. They're coming in all sorts of ways from elsewhere. And so, to the point that's been said, we've got to do a little bit of everything. We're doing interdiction. We had a few cases last year, wiretap investigations, disrupting systems of guns. Two from North Carolina, two wiretaps, and another of ghost gun parts coming from Pennsylvania. We're doing that work But that's just a piece of the puzzle. It's addressing the trauma, the sort of the underlying issues, and we're doing that as well. And I can talk about some things we're doing in that space. I will just say on a good note that obviously we have a lot more work to do, which is why we're here. But last year, we ended the year to date in Manhattan with shootings and homicides down, 15 to 20%, and then the first quarter of this year, shootings and homicides again down, year to date, and that's mapping our other index crimes. So a lot more work to do, but encouraging trends in Manhattan.
Representative Love, you are from Tennessee. We've been talking a lot about Tennessee for one reason or another these last couple of months. But from your vantage point, what is driving these trends in gun violence?
This is my 11th year in the legislature, and I've watched our gun laws get worse every year, from allowing guns to be carried in parks, to allowing guns to be carried in bars, to allowing guns to be stored in a vehicle in the parking lot of where you work and it's not illegal, to now permitless carry in Tennessee. And for me, it's increased the opportunity, to everyone's point, for someone to have difficult situations and choose to use a gun as the means to express that difficulty that they're having. I think I'm getting the phrase right, if I'm wrong. There's a thing called time to crime, which is the distance between when the gun is purchased and when the crime is committed. I think the statistics show that from 2016 to 2019, it was about 13%, but now it's about 23% of those particular guns that have been used in that time to crime. So we're talking about increased access has caused increased opportunities for persons to, again, act out on those frustrations, notwithstanding the fact that in COVID-19, you had a lot of nonprofits that would have been able to help persons who were dealing with issues, just were unable to work, right? Funds were frozen because people were shut down. And so you have that worst case scenario with this perfect, unfortunate, perfect scenario, perfect storm. But for me, the root cause I saw legislatively was increased gun access through the laws we were passing in Tennessee. I think one of the mayors referenced it in this panel earlier. The difficulty in that is states model each other. So what happens in Texas comes to Tennessee, goes to Florida, goes to Mississippi. And so these laws travel across the country.
I see lots of head nodding, and let's make this a conversation. And I'm gonna skip the second part of the twofold and just jump right on in, because there's some specifics we need to talk about. So Representative Love, in Tennessee, I just read in the paper today that Governor Lee has called for the legislature to come back in special session in August because it adjourned without doing anything about gun safety. One, is the governor serious? And two, if he is, what's going to result out of this special session? Will anything really get done in Tennessee?
Yeah, I think he's serious, and I do want to take the time to give credit to my colleagues, Representative Justin Jones and Justin Pearson and Gloria Johnson, for helping push the envelope on this special session, and for their courage. We told the governor before we adjourned, if the bill you propose before we leave does not need any Democratic votes, that's not the right bill. It's 24 of us in Tennessee in the House, and if you can get the bill passed without us, it's not the right bill. And so I hope that the bill that he brings is going to need our help, because we have some colleagues on the other side who said already that they're not going to vote for certain things. And so if he's serious about this, and if they're serious about it, they will talk to us, they will enlist our aid, because we're not trying to stop anything from happening, but we want real gun reform that has common sense attached to it to help us stop all this senseless killing that's going on, and it can be done.
So there was something in the panel that happened downstairs in the main theater before Mayor Adams spoke, with mayors from 4 cities across the country. One of them that I can see right now, who I'm going to quote, Mayor Tashara Jones of St. Louis, was talking about, and this gets, you've all talked about the trauma You've talked about the ready access to guns. But there was something Mayor Jones talked about, which I had not heard of, and that was the Second Amendment Preservation Act, which makes it basically impossible for law enforcement to take a gun away from someone who has it. It allows that person to sue the police officer for, was it $50,000, I think you said, Mayor Jones? How I bring this up because we see lots of legislative moves like that, laws like that on the books that make it difficult to maybe even impossible for law enforcement to do anything to stem gun violence. So I'd just love for you, I'll go to you, Nick, and Greg, to talk about this, the impact of these state and local laws on reducing gun violence.
There's just no overstating it. I mean, gun laws matter. States with the strongest gun laws have the lowest rates of gun deaths. That's a settled question. I'll debate it with anybody. And you can look at it across any way you want to slice it. It is true. And when states, as Representative Love was saying, are going the other direction, it's not good for the states. It's also not good for the cities in the states, who often then get politically scapegoated as what's going on in your city, mayor. And it's like, well, what's going on in my city is the laws that you've either failed to pass or even repealed in some sort of, pandering to the gun lobby, giving away sort of what seems like a symbolic, celebration of the Second Amendment that gets you points in your primary race, but that is actually endangering the lives of individuals across the state, and in particular in our cities. And what a thing for the party of law and order to say, I'm going to tie the hands of law enforcement and make it basically impossible for them to do their job. Missouri also had the unfortunate distinction of passing a nullification bill that made it very difficult, or if not impossible, for local law enforcement to even cooperate with the federal government as, again, some sort of a hat tip or genuflect to a gun lobby that's very hostile to the government, federal or otherwise, that's very hostile, honestly, to law enforcement. So state gun laws absolutely matter. When states like New York are able to rebound in part after the spike during COVID for all of the causes that we've talked about, it's in part because of the strong gun laws in the state. Other states and other cities that are trying to solve things through law enforcement and after the fact arresting, their homicide rates and gun violence rates are not going down right now. And the truth is that those rates are also happening outside of our cities. They're happening in rural counties as well. Gun laws absolutely matter. Going the other direction or making guns part of this kind of culture war, we're just going to thumb our nose in the name of the Second Amendment at public safety, are incredibly dangerous. We're losing lives every day because of it.
Greg?
Yeah, I think, and one other scary part about this, there's an onslaught of gun laws that encourage the use of guns. You know, shoot first laws, what we like to call them, or stand your ground. And we've seen this huge surge where cheerleaders are getting shot in parking lots. You know, young black boys are knocking on the door and they're at risk of getting shot. And we just passed the anniversary of Ahmaud Arbery, right? And we're watching how these laws play out. And every state that has passed these stand your ground law, I don't even like that name personally, shoot first laws, every time they pass these shoot first laws, you see a huge spike in homicides. You see a huge spike in quote unquote justified homicides. And then you also see a huge spike in police related violence because they're trying to respond to it. And we did an event with Jon Stewart on his show, and we had law enforcement speak out on this, and they don't want to see this either. You know, they're one of the biggest voices that say we do not need everyone walking around with guns on their hips because that doesn't make their jobs easier or safer. And so not only is it causing more harm in communities, causing more harms against communities like ours, but it's also making law enforcement a more dangerous world. So I think we have to figure out how to push back on not just the hardware-related laws, but the laws that encourage the use of firearms to resolve conflicts. I will say there's some positive sides to this, though. In 2022, we saw 30 states pass laws to increase funding for community violence intervention. We've seen 10 states ban assault weapons. And so just as much as I think we tend to lean into the negative, but there are a lot of organized activists and survivors that are pushing back and fighting back and creating real change. I mean, just yesterday in Texas, they passed the raise the age bill out of committee. Now, who would have think you would do that in Texas, right? But that's a real organized activist force that's fighting back. And in states, they're winning. In North Carolina, we have the first statewide Office of Violence Prevention in the South. So we're really encouraged by that. We're seeing something similar bubble up in other states. And so just as much as there's negative, there's a lot of positive that we should shine a light on as well.
All right, DA Bragg, you were going to say something, then you say, nah, never mind. Go ahead.
So, well, I was just going to say, because I'm a New Yorker, I can be provincial. I think this is the best place on earth. And sometimes you can say, well, what's going on in North Carolina or Tennessee? But like you talked about the stats there today, but those are our stats tomorrow, right? Those laws, that is the IRE pipeline come to life. So that was one thought I had. And the other on what you both talked about is law enforcement. I would say some of the most interesting conversations I had post-Bruen was with law enforcement here in the city about what is it like to do a traffic stop in Texas, right? Because like we don't, if you stop someone in Manhattan and that person has a gun, like we know that that's unlawful, right? And we can talk about how Bruen has not immediately changed the landscape, but how it may down the road. And I don't hear enough of those voices about like the palpable anxiety of like, what's that going to mean for my job when I go to do that stop? What are they doing in those other jurisdictions? Because that's not something we're dealing with here yet.
Mm-hmm. Nick, I see you.
Well, I mean, across the country, and I really appreciate you going to the positive. I was going to get there, I promise. I'm a very optimistic person by nature. But in the states that are going permitless, which is to say being allowed to carry a loaded firearm on your person in public without any special vetting, law enforcement is at every committee hearing testifying against it because they know that that's going to increase the the likelihood that they're going to be interfacing with somebody with a firearm. And so they're on record in most places, including very, very gun-friendly jurisdictions, saying like this is going to make our job harder. But when you look at like the NYPD that does not have this as the, in every traffic stop and every street stop, like as a primary concern, you really do see how bad it could become for law enforcement and the community, because the way they deal with it, the way the state trooper in Georgia deals with it, is they assume the person is armed and they assume they're going to use the gun against them. Right. And that's a very different sort of interface between law enforcement and a civilian than in other places.
I know this is a specialized audience here. Y'all know all this, but for the folks who might be watching via live stream, they heard DA Bragg you say Bruen, which I know refers to a Supreme Court case. But why? Well, one, what is Bruen, and why does Bruen hold such significance for law enforcement? Or Nick, or Greg, or Representative Lowe.
I'm happy to do it, but I feel we all know Bruen. Here, you go first.
Well, all right.
Who can be maybe whoever can be the most optimistic.
I'll be optimistic this time.
I've
learned my lesson. There is a lot of reason for hope. Well, Bruen was a Supreme Court decision that came out last year. It was the most significant Supreme Court decision on the Second Amendment in probably 15 years since it first articulated a right to possess a firearm for home defense. In short, what the Supreme Court decided was that right to possess a firearm extends outside of the home to personal protection. What it did, in fact, in the case was strike a New York law that required you show good cause to carry a loaded firearm in public, which, as a practical matter, meant, are you are you moving money late at night? Are you engaged in a profession that requires you to carry? That's one of the reasons that we didn't have a lot of public carry in New York. It struck that law. That law is over 100 years old. That's bad. Worse is the test that the Supreme Court came up with, which I will, I will keep it for the folks at home, was just a lot of made up stuff about history. And what has happened in the year since Bruen is courts are all over the place on laws that are, violate the Second Amendment or don't. The good news is that there's probably a path out of Bruen, one where we can in the courts, and we're doing this every day at Everytown and elsewhere across the country. We're doing the work to try to get the court cases set up so that it's not, all is lost, but rather back to a place where common sense can reign. But it has had real impact, including in New York.
And I think for me, legislatively, as a result of that, we see odd bills coming out. We had one this session that said that if you are out hunting, you are now allowed to carry a handgun that you don't have a permit for while you're hunting. And so I asked the question, I said, well, if you're hunting, don't you already have a gun that you're hunting with? And they said, yeah, but I need another one.
You gotta be ready for them close range bear attacks, you know?
Right, so I'm like, you know, are you? And so these are the issues that we face, right? Because once it comes down, you have these odd bills that come out and make you ask the question, like, who thought of this? And so I'd emphasize to us, it's not just interest groups, there are also policy interest groups, right? Where you'll see these bills are the exact same, except for the name of the state is changed. And when you engage people who bring these bills and you ask them questions, they cannot explain the bill they're carrying because they've just been given the bill, and the only thing that's changed is the state name. And this is when we discover that there are policy institutes pushing these things. And so that's one thing we need to be concerned about also, is how are other policy institutes pushing these bad gun bills.
DA Bragg, Nick apparently took the positive view of Bruen, so
He's got a different dictionary than we do.
No, I know. So what's the negative view of Bruen?
Look, I'll try to do both positive and negative. Long term, if it's not, we don't have some changes through litigation, it's bad, right? Because we'll see more and more guns. We've heard the statistics of what that means. I can say in Manhattan, where we obviously have strong laws in New York, it is not a primary concern right now, because the primary concern is guns that are unlawful. I mean, that's still where our focus is. I don't know if that's not the most positive news. That's where our focus is. We're focusing there. But I shudder to think of a time when we're having to do what we're doing on unlawful guns, and at the same time think about lawful guns under Bruen. That's a very, very scary thought. I guess that's not optimistic at all.
So maybe this is going to end up being a rhetorical question, but I keep coming back again to Mayor Jones in the previous panel, where I can't remember if you were asked, Mayor Jones, what are the 3 things you would want or need to stem gun violence in St. Louis? And she immediately rattled off universal background checks, red flag laws, assault weapons ban. And on each of those, I don't have the Fox News poll in front of me, but from last week, overwhelming majority, over 80% of the American people support each one of these things. So why can't these get done? Is it as simple as these policy institutes taking bills all over the country, including to Washington, to prevent those things from happening? Do we not have the political will to do at least those 3 basic common sense reforms that a majority of the American people want?
I would say when you look at a lot of primary elections at the state level, voter turnout is so low that you have a primary election for a state house or state senate seat that may be decided from 3,000 people voting, and the person winning may win by 300 or 400. So as a result, they see that as their base. And when you have money coming in from organizations that are not for gun reform, then these people think that they will not be reelected. In Tennessee, that happened. We had someone who was highly challenged by the gun lobby, and they lost their seat, and they were in leadership in the Republican Party. So that fear sets in. The solution, I think, is that those people who live in those communities who haven't voted in the last 2 or 3 elections need to let this person know, or that person know, I will support you in the next election if you would pass common sense gun reform. You don't have to worry about this part of your base voting against you. I will be there. There are thousands of us who will vote, because then you convince them that there is a path forward for them.
Yeah.
Go ahead, Greg.
Yeah, honestly, and I think that shift is starting to happen. And this is some more optimism for everybody. But in Congress, we're seeing survivors of gun violence now leading the charge. You know, the Congressional Black Caucus chair is Representative Stephen Horsford. He's one of the biggest advocates for community violence intervention and public health approaches to reducing gun violence in Congress. He's now the chair and a survivor. We have Representative Lucy McBath, who's leading the charge in so many different ways. We have Maxwell Frost, who was literally an organizer, who probably would have been in this audience, you know, before he ran for office. And audience, not the panel, audience, an organizer in March for Our Lives is now one of the most charismatic and the youngest member of Congress we have. And that's just a handful. I mean, there's at least 20 survivors or people who have been directly impacted by violence that are leading in Congress. We are now seeing gun violence be the #3 issue discussed when thinking about national politics. When I was shot 10 years ago, right after the failed background checks vote in the Senate, you couldn't even get Democrats to talk about gun violence. It was such a taboo issue. Now you have the president loud screaming for assault weapons ban in almost every single speech. So this is now not just a fringe issue. This is a leading issue where we're seeing more folks run for office. We saw what happened in Tennessee. You tried to expel those guys. Now they're sitting with Oprah, right? And, you know, and it's like, look, that's a whole different world that we're in because I think people are really fed up. You know, in Uvalde, we saw survivors sit there for 13 hours to fight for change. In the Texas legislature, when they came outside, there were hundreds of supporters waiting for them, right? Like, America is starting to fight back and stand up and elect who they want to see and fight for the policy we want to see. And while, yes, we're going up against this multi-billion-dollar industry, I mean, gun industry made more money than Nike last year, right? But the humans and the people behind this issue and crisis, I think, will prevail.
Are you about to be the downer?
I'm not going to be
Go
the
ahead,
downer.
down it.
I'm
Down
gonna be the downer.
I mean,
I will second that and say things are changing. And Greg's exactly right to look to about 10 years ago when a bill comes up after the Sandy Hook massacre, and we didn't get 50 Democratic votes for the bill, let alone Republican votes. Cut to last summer, Bipartisan Safer Communities Act, 15 Republicans voting for a bill. A strong but modest bill, but with 15 Republican votes. It is guns are no longer the third rail in politics. What we're building, right, is the infrastructure and power within the states and the federal government, you know, to put some meat behind what Representative Love is saying is like, no, we'll be there for you. You take that vote, we will be there for you. We'll be there for you in your primary. We'll be there for you in your general election. And you build the infrastructure where the American people, including apparently a lot of Fox News viewers, are saying, you know, what in America gets 80% approval rating? I cannot think of a thing. I risked my own life by saying I think gun policy is more popular than Taylor Swift online. I was told that was a bad career choice and I'll never do it again. But I think it might be. I think it actually might be. And so that means that the politicians, at their own peril, ignore this issue as the dynamics continue to change.
Okay, I just want to take care of some housekeeping things that we could. So we have 10 minutes completely or 10 minutes until Q&A? Completely. Okay, well then that means we're going to turn it over to Q&A. If you have a question, please make sure that it is a question, that it is concise and not a speech. I don't mean to be rude, but if you do launch into a speech, I will interrupt you and I will be rude doing it. So I'll start over here with the young. Do we have microphones? Okay, just. Or you know what? Here, I've always wanted to do this. No, I'm gonna do it. No, Carol, let me do it. Let me do it. Carol, let me do it.
It's like Ricky Lake.
Ricky Lake. Okay, but I'm gonna hold on to the mic.
So that I can.
It's control.
Okay. I'm Patrice from DC. Thank you. So most states have felon in possession statutes that carry stiffer penalties than actually shooting someone with a firearm. It seems to put law enforcement's focus on looking for people who have prior system involvement instead of risk factors like domestic violence, alcohol abuse, and those sorts of things. Do you agree that those penalties should be changed and that we should instead focus law enforcement's attention on the things we know are risk factors for gun violence?
Nice. Thank you.
So don't know what to do.
No,
Looking
go
at
ahead,
our
no.
moderator. Okay,
You answer
looking
the
for you
question.
with Q. Look, I think we have to focus, and this is what we're doing in the DA's office, on the there's a very small percentage of people who are driving the violence. So we have, and the president came at the mayor's invitation, a meeting every single day, federal, state, and local partners focusing on that very small percentage that are driving gun violence in New York. And that's where our focus should be. I'm so glad you mentioned domestic violence, because I don't think we talk about that enough. We just did a horrific case a couple of days ago in Manhattan, which is illustrative of that intersection. And so we are in the office, in addition to sort of Iron Pipeline, looking at the folks who we know are driving the violence, are also looking at those domestic violence indicators. That's extraordinarily important, so I'm glad you mentioned that.
And I just want to add, I really appreciate your question, because there's this overwhelming stereotype that gun violence is connected to felony activity. According to the Black Homicide Victimization Report by the Violence Policy Center, 69% of homicides in the Black community are not connected to another felony, and only 11% are connected to gang activity. So we have to think about not just the law enforcement approach, what is our all-of-government approach to address these moments that lead to homicides, and it's not always tied to felony activity, which I think brings it back to trauma. So thank you.
It's an excellent point. Okay, we have a brief comment, brief question. I'm holding on to this. No, I'm serious.
Thank you. My name is F. Dominique Toussaint. I'm the chairman of MyParkingTickets.com. I'm going to refocus the attention of the room. We're talking of guns in New York City. I grew up in this city. I was a Brooklyn kid. I'm pretty sure I can win a congressional seat in Texas at this moment on that issue because of what occurred. Yeah.
No, you can't. No. I know, we need your question, because now, how many minutes do we have left?
The question is this. The question is this. If, for example, someone has a gun and a judge arbitrarily decides that they would remove that weapon from them, or the right, would they not have due process to contest it? Because if a person doesn't have possession of that weapon and the judge makes that decision, they automatically lose it. That's all I say.
I mean, we have, I think this is a red flag law question. We have a law like that in New York. You probably have national perspectives, which does have, due process, built into it. There's a hearing, so it's not as though there's no process. I don't know if
and that's actually one of the things we're trying to consider in Tennessee is how do we get to a place where if a person does have that issue and they need to have that emergency risk protection order, that there's due process, but there's also a chance to have the public be safe.
Okay, and we have a, oh, go ahead, Greg, go ahead.
No, I just want to say, too, there's been too many moments, especially recently, where these mass shootings could have been avoided. Buffalo is a perfect example of where there were already multiple flags, law enforcement was already involved and concerned, but there wasn't the infrastructure to step in. And it's one thing to say, hey, in Texas I could run for office. It's another thing to look into the eyes of these families and say we could have prevented it, but we didn't go through the steps. And I think that's what we have to stay focused on is this isn't a debate about just rights and policies and what people care about. This is life or death, And I've hold hands with these folks at vigils, at funerals, and it hurts me so much to know that we could have prevented that in Uvalde, in Nashville, in Buffalo, and countless other incidents. So I just want to ground that.
Okay, question here. I see you too. I'm gonna,
Okay. Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Fidel Osorio. I'm a researcher here at John Jay. My question is actually surrounded more around the law enforcement component. Some people feel that the United States of America and our government does not have a monopoly on violence because a lot of Americans are allowed to own and hold guns. And that's part of the culture of America, that we derived our national identity from fighting back against oppressors. So, and I'm not one of those people. I think we should take all the guns. But how do you get somebody who believes that so deeply that guns are a religious right to hold and own? What is the message to them who are like, I'm a responsible gun owner, I do everything right. What do we say to them saying that your culture is hurting people?
Yeah.
Great. Nick?
Excellent question. Of course, we have to have that conversation day in and day out across the country. Here's the good news. I'm going to try to hold to my promise to give you good news. Gun owners are with us on this issue, right? When we're talking about policy, when we're talking about background checks, when we're talking about red flag laws, right? Gun owners are with us. There are vocal gun owner groups, lobbies, organizations, the kind that fund primary opposition and the like, that are not with us and will never be with us. And we can engage with them and value engagement with them and understand if there are real concerns. But ultimately, we're not going to get that very small group. But gun owners are with us because they want that right, because they value that right, and they know that with firearms ownership comes responsibility. They want to be part of a solution that allows both them to have their firearm and it not to lead to mass shootings, daily gun violence, and gun suicide. So that's the good news, is that we have that conversation all the time, and what we hear time and again, if you're talking policy to gun owners, they're right there with us. They make up some of the 80% that Jonathan was mentioning earlier. But we can have these reasonable laws without messing with somebody's right to own a firearm. It's very consistent with the Second Amendment. Some have readings of the Second Amendment that are inconsistent with reality. With them, I have very little to say, but for most, the two are not actually in conflict.
And I think if you look at most laws on the whole spectrum of legislation, laws are not designed to restrict those who are going to be law-abiding. They're meant to keep those who are not going to abide by the laws in some guardrails. Even the simple speeding law, right? The speed limit on a highway is not designed to restrict those who are going to do the speed limit, but to say those who want to speed, hey, this is the limit, this is how fast you can go. And so the same thing with gun laws, it's the same thing. For those who don't want to abide by the laws, these background checks and requirements for permits are necessary.
All right, thank you. Question here.
Hi, I just want to thank you all for being here. My name is LaToya Coleman. I'm the Community Educational Counsel for District 8. I just want to say, how can we help the students? Because it starts with them. You know, my son experienced such trauma where a child was shot in the head right by him, by the PAL in the Bronx. And I think I'm sorry everyone for getting so emotional, but it hurts that, the Bronx don't really get as much as everybody else. And kids are scared to come to school. Parents are scared to take their children. How can we help them to not go to the streets to look for love when they, maybe they're suffering at home?
Thank you for sharing that. And I really think in this whole effort to address gun violence, that's where we're failing the most, is that we're so focused on the hardware that we're forgetting about the people and the solutions that we know can change behaviors, right? And prevent someone from going from that victim and someone who saw something traumatic to now being someone who causes harm. And I think it's important for all of these discussions I come to that we realize this is a public health crisis, and we can't just take a crime control approach. We can't just take a regulation approach. We need to really think about what is the people-centered approach. What are we doing for our youth that have been traumatized? One of the hardest things for me was when a young man was shot, and we came to visit his mother, and this is when I worked in victim services, and I remember seeing his little brother, and his little brother was so traumatized that somebody had bought him a rabbit, and he couldn't even talk. He was just playing with the rabbit. And I'm thinking like, man, you've been so traumatized, you haven't even processed this. The entire family's mourning. We just left the funeral, and you can't even accept that it's reality. And we had to walk out of that room, and we had nothing to offer him. But yet we're saying that we're serious about gun violence, but we're not focusing on the people that have been impacted and traumatized every day. So I think the first things first is we have to improve our access to victim services and what that means. In the state of New York, only 4% of those victimized by gun violence get some type of financial compensation. So that's terrible because of all the barriers. And that's just financial compensation. But But then we have to think about, what does the wellness look like? What does the mental health support look like? What does the grief counseling look like? When Buffalo happened, there was hundreds of people at vigils crying in tears, and they had 4 grief counselors, 2 of which were young, straight out of college kids that came up to try to help out, right? But we're not doing enough to help people deal with that trauma that impacts them. Secondly, that's why we're huge proponents for community violence intervention, strategies that work with those who are most at risk, those who have been traumatized, those that have caused harm. We know they work, we know they're impactful, but we haven't seen the resources. When we started advocating for this in 2019, there was 0 federal dollars. Now there's $14.2 billion that CVI strategies are eligible for, and that's because we've been fighting for these people-centered approaches. And so I just want to say that you are right that we're not doing enough by youth in Bronx, but we're not doing enough not doing enough right by youth across the country. And we have to make sure that all of these debates come back to what resources are we providing for those traumatized and impacted, just as enthusiastically as we focus on access to firearms.
Amen. Your comments really struck a nerve for me. Like you, I do a lot of meeting with shooting victims, mothers who've lost children to gun violence, and the saddest part for me is the age of gun violence is going down and down and down. And we haven't explicitly said it's in New York City. This is a racial justice issue, right? 97% of shooting victims in New York City are Black or Latino. That's an eye-popping statistic. So some of the things that we're trying to do in the DA's office to sort of operationalize what you're talking about, we have a phenomenal, people think we're all lawyers, right? We have phenomenal victim services group of clinicians and advocates and social workers. And something I'm sort of proudest about is we started a group within that group called the Witness Aid Service Unit Men of Color. Because of that 97%, most are men. And when you were talking, I was thinking about we were meeting with a family, with a grieving mother who had lost her son, and her grandchild was there, 14. He just come to the meeting. And our victim aid folks that were talking to the mother, were talking about the case, they were looking at that mental health trauma, right? And they called in our Men of Color team, and he sat up, and we started what's gonna be a years-long engagement. We always say, it's not tethered to the life of a case, like we're there. And so that's important. You mentioned the funding. We have a bill in New York State that we're supporting that will change who's eligible, because sometimes that eligibility is just focused on, are you cooperating with my office? Well, no, you have trauma whether or not you're cooperating with my office. So we're supporting that. Something else that I think is critically important, just 2 more things, you mentioned our crisis management groups. So something we did last year, which we're going to try to scale up and do more of, we did a case. We did a gun interdiction case involving significant violence, and we prosecuted the folks we thought were culpable. We saw a group of people who were close to the fire, and I would say kids close to the fire, and we said, if we don't do something, they're going to be in an indictment 2 years from now. So I guess it's not quietly because I'm not saying it from a big room, but we very quietly went to some of our stakeholders and said, this is not, Manhattan DA's office can't go out in the street and do this. They're not going to talk to us. Here's a list. Don't report back to us. Do your thing. Then report it back. Do more of that. It's working. So we need to do that. And the third thing is old-fashioned engagement. So last year, and this was probably the most joyous moment since I've been district attorney, we did grants, anti-violence youth grants, to 10 organizations that are working directly with our youth and our youth affected by gun violence, to paint murals, to do lighting in places that we know. And people say, oh, that's soft on crime. No, we have the research, right? If you light an area where people shoot, shooting goes down. We know also if we get money to our young people during the summer months, that is very helpful. So we did that as an office, but what I always tell folks, right, the front line of gun violence is the Little League coach, the Sunday school teacher, our traditional teachers, our social workers, and there's our moderator. To the list of things that we need to do, they're all the sort of gun bills. We need to invest in mental health.
Yeah,
Real quick.
All I want to say though is when Alvin starts, when DA Bragg starts with numbers dropping in New York City, dropping in Manhattan. That, what you just heard from him is one of the reasons why. And constantly across the country, all we hear about is what are the police doing or not doing, right? And in places that don't have the gun laws, don't have the social service infrastructure, aren't trying to treat the trauma in the community, they're not seeing the numbers go down, but they're policing. Oh, they're doing plenty of that. But what you need is folks like DA Bragg, folks in New York City that are deeply invested in this. And I just want to say, tying these types of programs, those kinds of efforts to the success is a huge part of spreading those programs across the country.
Okay, we've got less than probably 3 minutes left, so I'm just warning, we're going to go over a little bit. But last question here. So, yeah, you're the last.
That I'm the last.
Last one, but
Okay,
fast.
so listen, I think we all agree that there are too many guns in our society. In fact, there are more guns than people, right? I want to know, is it possible that we can get at the real solution, which is, of course, amendment of the Second Amendment, so that it is interpreted as not everybody in this society shall have a gun.
Can we amend the Second Amendment? Thank you very much, sir. An amendment of the Second Amendment.
Well, I think technically, legislatively, you'd have to amend the Constitution.
Oh.
No, I'm not saying, but that piece, I think the issue with the Second Amendment is that guns have evolved since the amendment was written. We're talking about muskets, right? Now we got AK-47s and AR-15s and grenade launchers. Someone told me the other day you can actually attach a grenade launcher onto AR-15, I think. And so that's what's happened is legislators have not conceived the fact that that amendment was written in a different time, and that time is not now. And so that's the conversation I think that is easier to have rather than a constitutional amendment. I mean, it can be done, but I think that's a heavier lift. And again, folks understand that the evolution of of guns.
All right, we've got wrap up is what the sign says to me. So I'm gonna pretend like I'm a genie, and I'm gonna give you one wish, very briefly, one wish, if I could grant it, that would help or make it possible to stem the tide of gun violence in the country. And I'll start with Tennessee State Representative Harold Love.
Very simple for me in Tennessee, if we could reinstate the requirement for background checks and permits to carry guns in Tennessee, that would be a great start for us, because right now with permitless carry, you don't know who's carrying a gun. To your point, when the police pull up on somebody, they don't know if a traffic stop, someone has a gun, and they're gonna be reactionary in their response. So for me, that would be the biggest step, is to reinstate the requirement for permits for those who want to carry guns in Tennessee.
Manhattan District Attorney Alvin Bragg.
Comprehensive federal legislation so that even as New York is doing things, we're not vulnerable to what's happening elsewhere. This is a nationwide issue, and we need nationwide solutions.
Nick Suplina from Everytown.
A complete and total understanding by all stakeholders in the country that this is a public health crisis, that it needs to be addressed as a public health crisis with public health solutions, and then we'll be on the path to solving this problem.
And Greg Jackson,
God, Nick,
Community Justice Action Fund.
Too many panels. He stole mine. And he knew he did it. He winked at me afterwards. Like, all right. I don't one-up you, though. I'm going to steal his stat. So, gun violence cost our economy $557 billion, according to Everytown for gun safety. And so my one wish would be that we reinvest dollars to address this crisis in a real way. If we put up $100 billion to address gun violence, we could eradicate, I would argue, 70–80% of what's happening. If mayors like our mayor right here, Mayor Cesar Jones, had that type of budget, she has the solutions. So that would be my big thing, is invest the dollars that we're already losing to death. And I think that would be a true way to end this crisis.
Gentlemen, thank you very much.